Okay, today I want to look at the text of the 10 pronouncements at Sinai. Yesterday we talked about very general philosophical issues. Today I want to look at the text. There's a number of items in the text which are worthy of careful consideration. Take a look in the Blue Book on page 411. Everybody knows that when you're reading a translation, you have to be very careful. And what we do is we file that away in our brains. Okay, you have to be careful in translations. Then we read, and we take the English, and we take the English as if it were 100%, and it isn't. Now here's one grossly misleading element. Remember the Sabbath day to sanctify it. 6 days shall you work and accomplish all your work. Twice, W-O-R-K. You have no clue that the two words in Hebrew are utterly different words. Utterly different. Completely unrelated words. One is ta'avod, and the other is malachtecha. Ta'avod means to work, which could result in aching muscles, sweat, exhaustion, loss of energy, being tired. Malacha has no connotation of that whatsoever. What malacha might be, I'll talk about in a minute, but they are two entirely different concepts. And then in the next line, it says, seventh day is Shabbos to Hashem your God, you shall not do any work. Then it's crucial to know, which work are we talking about? Are we talking about the ta'avod work, or are we talking about the malacha work? And the answer is we're talking about the malacha work, not the ta'avod work. Now, malacha is not well translated as work at all. Ta'avod is a tolerable translation. But malacha is not well translated as work at all. A rough description of malacha, notice I said description, not definition. A rough description of malacha would be an action which is intentional, not by accident, skillful, not done in a clumsy, inefficient way, creative, not just purely destructive or wanton, creative, physical transformation. Intentional, skillful, creative, physical transformation. Now, having told you that, tell me what you think of the following scenario, which happened in the United States of America in the last century thousands of times, maybe tens of thousands of times. The Jew says to the rabbi, Rabbi, I understand why it used to be forbidden to light fires on Shabbos. Because lighting fires is work. It's hard work. Rubbing two sticks together, or whatever other method you use, is going to be hard work, and the Torah says don't do any work. But today, Rabbi, all I do is strike a match. That's not work. So surely today, there shouldn't be any prohibition against striking matches. But now, as we just saw, what's prohibited on Shabbos is not work, but malacha. Let's take the description of malacha that I gave you and see if it fits striking a match. Malacha is something that's done intentionally. Well, you don't strike matches when you're thinking about something else. And skillfully, you have to be taught the skill. It's not something that's automatic and obvious, like stepping on a stone. Creative, physical transformation. It creates fire, creates light, creates heat. Striking a match is a paradigm malacha, even if it isn't work. And the poor English reader says, but it says right here in the book, don't do any work. And striking matches isn't work. He's right. In terms of the English, he's absolutely right. Striking matches isn't work. It's just that this prohibition for Shabbos has nothing to do with prohibiting work. It's prohibiting malacha. And malacha is definitely a good description of striking a match. So that's the first thing that has to be understood. Eventually, if one wanted to understand what Shabbos is, one would have to understand why this particular type of activity is forbidden on Shabbos. This is not aching muscles. It's not weightlifting or moving furniture. According to this, there may be other things that are involved. According to this, which is the key element, this is the one for which, if you violate it, it's a capital crime. There's nothing to do with moving furniture or lifting weights or getting exhausted doing push-ups. This has to do with malacha. Intentional, skillful, physically creative transformation. Okay, now let me ask you, does the word Shabbos mean anything? Or is it just a name of one day of the week? That's a bit of a trick question. In Hebrew, almost all names have meaning, because meaning in Hebrew is carried by certain 3-letter or 2-letter combinations, and the names are built out of those same combinations. So it's always appropriate to ask, what meaning does a name have? In English, that's not typically true. George and Fred, I think, don't have any meaning at all. They're just names, labels by which you can refer to things. But in Hebrew, that's not so. Shabbos does have a meaning. Do you have a clue what the meaning of Shabbos is?
Rest.
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 Nope. Although Shabbos is a day of rest, the word Shabbos does not describe rest. How about sit? Lashevet is to sit. But no, Shabbos has nothing to do with sitting. How about seventh day of the week? No, Shabbos has nothing to do with the seventh day of the week. The word Shabbos in Hebrew means to cease, to stop an activity. Lishbos means to stop an activity. In modern Hebrew, the word for a strike is shvita. Of course, using that word does presuppose that beforehand the workers were working, which in Israel isn't always a fair assumption. But that's the idea of it. It's a cessation of some prior activity. Maybe now we can understand why every place that Shabbos is mentioned, it always says, 6 days shall you perform some activity or other, and the 7th day is Shabbos. Because Shabbos, by its very definition, exists in contrast to prior days in which something was done, and on Shabbos that ceases being done. And by the way, given that that's the meaning of the word Shabbos, the Christian calendar does have a peculiarity in it. Because according to the Christian calendar, which day of the week is the Sabbath?
Sunday.
Sunday. And which day of the week is that in the Christian calendar? The first day of the week. You can't start by stopping. That just doesn't work in logic. If you're going to stop, there must be something that you were doing before that you're now stopping. How can you start the work with the Sabbath day, which is the stopping day? Now, historically, there's an explanation for how it happened, but it does leave them with this anomaly. The early Christians had 2 holy days a week. Shabbos, which was Saturday, of course, because it's the end of the week. And Sunday, which is the day in which they believe their leader was resurrected from the dead. When Constantine, the Roman emperor, decided to make his whole empire Christian, he said to the early Christian leaders, we're going to make the whole place Christian. By the way, he never became Christian. He remained a pagan to the end of his days. It was a political move. He was suffering from disunity of the various religions and ethnic groups. He said, we're unifying it. We'll all be Christians. They'll all be Christians. But he said to the Christian leaders, you're not getting 2 days a week. Forget it. Pick one. So they picked the resurrection because that was something that was unique to Christianity, and they moved the biblical Sabbath to Sunday from Saturday. Give you an insight into the kind of religion that it is, how its institutions were chosen for certain practical purposes, and all the rest. At any rate, the word Shvita, the word Shabbos, means cessation. Now, in context, as we just saw, it means cessation of malacha. By the way, the word Shabbos on occasion is used for holidays also, because on holidays there is also a cessation of malacha, not as much as you have on Shabbos. There are some things on holidays that you can do, and on Shabbos you can't, like cook. But there are many things that on holidays you cannot do. So it is a kind of mini Shabbos. It also carries its cessation of malacha. Okay, now, verse 9 says, 6 days shall you do avodah, and accomplish all your malacha. The 7th day is Shabbos, a cessation day to Hashem your God. You shall not do any malacha. And now comes a list of those who are included in the prohibition. You, your son, your daughter, your male slave, your female slave. The English here is a little delicate, but that's what the Hebrew means. your male slave, your female slave, your animal, and your convert within your gates. I'd like to just dwell on this list for a bit. I think this list raises a number of questions. Let's see if you can intuit some of the things about this list which a careful, intelligent, critical reader might want to ask.
Your animal comes before your convert, which is a human being.
Okay, number one, the order is very peculiar, putting an animal before a convert. Good. Now push the word animal further. What you said is correct. There's another question you could ask about the word, about animal being on the list. Does an animal have to keep Shabbos? This is the ones who are not supposed to do any malacha. Must you restrain your animal from doing malacha? Detaching a growing plant from its source of life is one of the 39 categories of malacha that you're not allowed to do. The animal's grazing. Must you stop the animal from grazing? Because it's cutting off or pulling up, depending upon the kind of animal it is, detaching the blades of grass and growth from the soil from which it grows? Certainly not. There is no reason whatsoever why an animal has to keep Shabbos. So what is the animal doing on the list altogether? And once you put it on the list, then we can ask your question, why put it before the convert? It does seem to be very peculiar that an animal should come before a human being.
You can't use your animal to help plow your...
Good, that's the answer. But I'm just registering questions now. You know enough to know the answer. We'll come back, but I just want to register questions. What else about the list could be questioned, perhaps? Is someone perhaps missing from the list?
Wife.
How about your wife? My. I can just hear the feminist critics, rising in chorus with their raw eggs ready to throw. What about the wife? Why is the wife missing from the list? The truth is that the answer to that question is much more profound than anything the feminists could possibly think of. But it's on the surface, it's a question that arises in people's minds as to why the wife is missing. Now, I'm going to explain to you a comment that Rashi makes. See if you can use Rashi's comment to answer the questions that we've raised. Rashi says that when it refers to your son and your daughter, it's referring to minor children only. A son before the age of 13 and a daughter before the age of 12. It's only referring to minor children. How does that help? Well, let's ask the question this way. This is a list of you and what? All the items that follow you on the list, what are they? How would you categorize them or describe them?
And your mishpacha, your family.
Well, I wouldn't say that the animal is my family, and I wouldn't say that the convert is my family.
People that keep Shabbos.
Well, then what's going to do with the animal? The animal doesn't keep Shabbos.
Your possessions.
Okay, possession, but then the convert is not going to. I think possessions is closer, but the convert is not going to fit too well. And I don't think we regard our children as our possessions. But you're moving in the right direction, I think. You and those for whom you are responsible. They're those for whom you have some responsibility. I think that's the right way to put it. Now, it's in order of greatest responsibility. Your greatest responsibility is to your children. After that, to your slaves because you own them, and they're human. After that, the animal because it's your possession. After that, for the convert, who is not your possession at all, so you have some responsibility. We'll have to see what kind of responsibility. But it works out smoothly if you understand that this is you and those for whom you are responsible. Okay, now what about the wife? Why isn't she on the list? Hint, that's a trick question. What's the right answer? Now, why did I say it's a trick question? Go back to what Rashi said. We're talking about children, only minors. Minor sons and minor daughters. Only minor sons and daughters. Why? Why is it only talking about minors? Because once they become adults,
Their own responsibility.
they have their own responsibility. That includes daughters. Have their own responsibility. So when the list starts with you, to whom is the you addressed?
Father.
Yes, to men and women equally. Why did you think it was only addressed to men? Hey, a little chauvinism lurking there? We're not chauvinists. The word you is addressed to men and women equally. You includes all adult Jews. Women have to keep Shabbos just like men have to keep Shabbos. They're equally responsible to keep Shabbos. No difference whatsoever between men and women vis-a-vis Shabbos. So, my wife is another adult Jew. There may be responsibilities for other adult Jews. They aren't on this list. They're the ones who are dependent upon us, children, slaves, and animals. They're our possessions. And then the convert, and they'll have to explain exactly what kind of responsibility is for the convert. Okay, now let's go back to animal. I make your point now. The animal is my possession, so I have some responsibility for him. It's surely not the responsibility that the animal should keep Shabbos. Animals don't have to keep Shabbos. So the responsibility is that the animal shouldn't do work for me on Shabbos. And the prohibition is really this. I mean, one has to be a little careful here. You are allowed to set up before Shabbos all sorts of mechanisms which on Shabbos will do things for you that are beneficial and which involve physical transformations as long as you set them up before Shabbos. The Torah prohibits only your activities on Shabbos. But here's an example. In the ancient times, threshing was often done by animals. What you'd had was a pole. You tied a rope around the neck of an animal, and at the other end of the rope you have a loop, and you have a pole sticking in the ground. You put the loop over the pole, so the animal is now tied to the pole but can move. You put the grain that needs to be threshed on the ground, and the animal walks round and round, stamping on the grain and thereby threshing the grain. That's how threshing was done. I was here in 1967, right after the Six-Day War, and we had tours to the Golan, and we could see Syrians threshing that way in 67, for what the Mishnah describes 1,800 years ago. Now, to take that loop and put it on the pole on Shabbos so that the animal will trample the grains and thresh the grains, that's forbidden. If the animal is doing something before Shabbos and keeps doing it, that's okay. I can't put him in a position on Shabbos where he does work for me, malacha for me. That I can't do. That's the animal. Now we come to the convert. Here, your translator had his back to the wall. The word in Hebrew is ger. Ger has two meanings, only one of which is convert. A convert means a person who becomes a Jew, who's a full-fledged Jew. But the word ger has another meaning. That's a non-Jew who keeps the Jewish laws for non-Jews. One is called a ger tzedek, a righteous ger, which refers to a full-fledged convert. And the other is a ger toshav. He's a ger who's living in your area. He's living the way the Torah wants him to live as a non-Jew. And he's part of the general population. Now here, your responsibility for him depends upon what kind of ger he is. If he's a ger toshav, not a convert, but a person who's living, keeping the laws that the Torah prescribes for non-Jews, that doesn't include Shabbos. A non-Jew can't keep Shabbos. He's prohibited from keeping Shabbos. And now it's July 16th, and there's a sudden heat wave. And the ger toshav is staying there Saturday morning, watering his petunias, which are otherwise wilting in the sun. And he looks across to his Jewish neighbor's petunias, which are wilting in the sun. And he says to his Jewish neighbor, would you like me to sprinkle some water on your petunias also, so they shouldn't wilt in the sun? The Jew has to say no. No, don't want you to do that malacha for me. I don't want to benefit from that malacha that you're doing for me. That's the responsibility that you have for a ger toshav, who's not a convert to Judaism. If he's a convert to Judaism, then there's a very subtle business here. The Ramban talks about it, Nachmanides. It's a very subtle business here. You find that the Torah doubles up mitzvos with respect to converts that already apply to them, because these mitzvos apply to all Jews, and a convert is a full Jew, and the Torah doubles it up anyway, because converts need and deserve special consideration above and beyond the consideration that's given to normally born Jews. For example, the Torah says, love your friend as yourself, which includes all Jews who have a proper relationship with the Torah, and therefore includes converts already. But then there's another one which says, V'ahavtam es-hager. You're supposed to love the convert as well, because converts need extra love, they need extra support. They made a gigantic sacrifice to take on a Jewish identity, a life of Torah, and the Torah wants us to show special love for them. Lo sonu ish es achiv. Don't oppress another Jew with words. Don't say something that will cause him pain. That applies to every Jew, and thereby applies to converts as well. Lo sonu es-hager. Another prohibition with respect to converts, because since they come from a different past, they're more sensitive, and it's easier to say something that will offend them. The Torah went out of its way to tell you to be especially careful when it comes to the possibility of hurting a non-Jew, a convert with words. This also, with respect to Shabbos, Shabbos is something which the non-Jew, before he converts, cannot keep. He's not allowed to keep. Now he becomes a Jew, and he's keeping it as a full-fledged Jew. A naturally born Jew has a special responsibility for the Shabbos of a convert. That would be the way you want to explain it if you're talking about a full-fledged convert. At any rate, that I think explains the list tolerably well. And as I stressed, it's important to remember that the wife is on the list. Are we together so far? Okay. Now the Torah says something which introduces a general theme, a quite deep general theme. The Torah goes on. Don't do malacha, because, 11, for in 6 days Hashem made the heavens and the earth, sea that are all in them, and he rested on the seventh day. That it does say rest. I'll explain rest in a minute. Yes, Hashem. Therefore, Hashem blessed the Sabbath day and sanctified it. We're being told that we shouldn't do malacha because God created the world in a certain sequence, 6 days of activity and a seventh day without. I will come back and explain the details of that. So we too should live our lives 6 days of activity and seventh day without. I think that should be questioned. He did it that way, so we should do it that way? Is that obvious? Is it obvious that we should imitate God? God being the infinite, spiritual, perfect creator of the universe, and we being finite creatures, created beings, at least part grossly physical. Is it obvious that if he did something, we should do something? I don't think that's obvious. If the Torah had said the opposite, we'd have been very happy with it. God is this way, and you are this way, because God is creator, and you are only a creature. God is infinite, and you're finite, and therefore God does these things, and you do those things. We have accepted that without any difficulty. And since we would have accepted without difficulty, that's at least as natural. So I think the fact that the Torah says you should celebrate Shabbos this way because of the way God set up the world, it's introducing a very important theme. There's a general theme that we should imitate God. That is a general Jewish theme. Mahu avato, just as he has certain characteristics, so you too should strive to develop for yourself those same characteristics. This broadens the category and deepens the category. It doesn't yet give an obvious explanation, but it does broaden and deepen it. Chazal say, just as he is merciful, so you too should be merciful. Just as he is gracious, so you too should be gracious. Others expand it, Maimonides, based on a source which perhaps we don't have. Just as he is holy, so you too should be holy. Even though that's contained in other places, but Mahu Afato, just as he is, so you should be, is something that Maimonides cites. Rabbeinu Yonah, I heard this from Moshe Shapiro, Shlita, I would never have found it myself. But Rabbeinu Yonah, not in the Shari Tshuva, but in a shorter essay, says, just as he creates worlds, so you too should create worlds. Whatever that means. But what the picture that we're getting in general terms is, we're here to develop godlike characteristics. Now, when you hear that, I'm sure that in your minds what resonates is the famous verse in Genesis that God created us, as the translations have it that are wrong, in his image. Really, the word in Hebrew, tselem, does not mean image. It has no visual connotations whatsoever. Maimonides points this out in the first chapter of the guide. Tela means sharing some important characteristics, sharing a certain form. Maybe those two are intimately related to one another. God created us sharing a form of His so that we could be like Him. Even though we're creatures, even though there's an infinite gulf between us and Him, He created us sharing some form with Him so that we could be like Him. Our being like Him is somehow expressive of the whole purpose of creation. Now, I'm not going to go into that because it's a long story and I've done it many times. But on the surface, that's what we're getting here. We're getting here, and this is the first time that I know of in the Torah where it's mentioned explicitly. Just as He created in 6 days, and on the 7th day ceased, so also you should be physically creative in the 6 days, and then cease that physical creativity in the 7th day. Now, let's go back and pick up some of the details. True, the word that's used here in the Hebrew for what God did in the 7th day is rested. It doesn't say Shavas, it says Vayonach. But I think that resting and ceasing malacha, ceasing creative effort, are very, very close in meaning. I think that when we hear the word rest, we build into it various associations in our minds which aren't part of the root meaning of the word. Here's an illustration of how to use the word rest to illustrate its bare meaning. He was in a sand trap, but he's an excellent golfer, and he hit the ball from the sand trap, and it reached the green and came to rest 2 inches from the cup. The ball came to rest. The ball was not relaxing. The ball was not recovering its powers. The ball was not giving a break to its aching muscles. Came to rest just means stopped moving. Rest is the opposite of motion. Rest, in a more general sense, can be the opposite of activity. Don't build in what happens to a human being after strenuous activity when he stops moving and he recovers his powers and his energy and the rest. That's not built into the word rest. It happens to be what occurs to a human being when he rests from hard labor. When it says that God rested, one shouldn't think he's heaving a sigh of relief and getting into his hammock and having a beer. That's just gross. What one should think of is he had 6 days of activity, and now there's no more activity. Now, what did God do during those 6 days of activity? Well, what He did was He created elements in the world. And although not all of them are physical, human soul is not physical, and angels are not physical, but on each of the 6 days, there was creation or organization of the physical. Spiritual things went along also, but every one of the 6 days has a physical expression. So now, the Torah says, each of the 6 days, God had an effect on the physical world. The 7th day, He ceased having new effects. The word new is important. Ceased having new effects on the physical world. That's roughly parallel to what the Torah is telling us to do. Malacha is intentional, skillful, physically creative activity that you do on 6 days. On the 7th day, you don't do that. So we really are paralleling the process of creation. That means that every week is a replay of the process of creation. We together so far? Now, last thing that I said also is the expression of a deep theme. Nothing God does is for waste. Nothing God does is for waste. Nothing is just simply thrown away. Sometimes things happen and then are superseded by other things. Conditions change, but everything that happens once leaves its mark on history, and that mark plays itself out in the future. You could have thought God created the universe because it needed to be created. And He created it a certain way for various reasons, to communicate various things about the importance of things and so on and so on. But finished, it's finished. The creation process is finished. Now the world is running along in a different phase, a phase of development and free will and choice and so on and so on. Not true. The process of creation repeats itself over and over again. It doesn't get lost. It's not co-signed to history. Everything that's built in at any point in time becomes a principle by which everything in the future operates. That's true in the physical history, it's true in the spiritual history, it's true in the Kabbalah, it's true across the board. Everything God does, he does as a foundation for functioning in the future. So, our repeating the Shabbos cycle, the creation cycle by our performance of Shabbos, is one of the examples of that application. This has all sorts of ramifications. For example, if you sing the songs of Shabbos, one theme that's repeated over and over again is simcha, joy. Etc. People have asked about that. Why is there an expression of simcha on Shabbos? Simcha is a mitzvah. The mitzvah of simcha applies in two contexts. One is v'samachta b'chagecha, rejoice on your holidays. Chag does not include Shabbos. The other is a verse in the 100th Psalm, Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha, whenever you're performing a mitzvah, any time, you should do it with joy because you're having the opportunity to serve God. There's no association of a mitzvah of simcha with Shabbos. So why would simcha be such a theme in all of the Shabbos poetry? And the prayers. Now, there is one reference in the Talmud to simcha on Shabbos, but it's not a reference of a mitzvah. In the tabernacle, there were trumpets, silver trumpets that were blown on various occasions. The Torah gives a list of occasions on which they should be blown, one of which is Uviyom Simchaschem, on the day of your simcha, of your joy. Says the Talmud, Elu Ashabosos. That's Shabbos. Okay, so there's a direct reference to simcha on Shabbos, but still, it's a reference to something which is in a cloud. Where is there simcha on Shabbos for the reference to be to apply? There's no mitzvah of simcha on Shabbos. So what does the reference in the Talmud mean? Now I'm quoting a Torah Tamima. Torah Tamima here says a great Hasidic idea. And for those of you who know what Torah Tamima was and will accuse me of misusing his name, I definitely will acclaim him for the Hasidic movement because, as you'll see, this idea is definitely a Hasidic idea. The Torah Tamima says, yes, there's no mitzvah, no obligation, no duty, no requirement, no commandment of simcha on Shabbos, 100%. But there's a reality of simcha on Shabbos. Because, as the Midrash explains to us, that first Shabbos, when God ceased creating in the physical world, the Midrash says, it's like a king who built a palace, and when he finished building the palace, he had a celebration for those who were close to him, because he finished that creative project. He celebrated. And that means there's simcha above. There's simcha above. And this is the Torah Tamima. A Jew whose soul is in tune with what's going on above naturally feels simcha. It's not an obligation, not a rule, not a requirement, not a commandment. It's a natural existence that a Jew feels that joy from above. So that's another idea that the sixth day and the seventh day pattern that we have really is a repetition of the original week of creation. God, so to speak, is going through that transition also every week. And there's simcha above, and because there's simcha above, there's simcha below. So here you have this principle that what we are doing is being godlike, becoming and developing for ourselves godlike characteristics, acting in a godlike fashion. All of that is essential to what we are created for. And it's expressed here, I think, the first time clearly in this command of how to keep Shabbos. Are we together? Okay. Now it says, Hashem blessed the Sabbath day and sanctified it. This is a subject of a gigantic literature. I'm just going to give you a skim off the top. To bless something means to increase. Blessing is always an increase of something that exists prior. Blessing is never brand new. Ex nihilo, yesh me'ayin, a brand new creation. The key passage, says the Ramban, is where this impoverished widow comes to Elisha and says, you know that I risked my life to serve God, my husband and I. Her husband was Avadi, the prophet. When Achav and Izebel, the king and queen, were trying to kill the prophets, this pair took 100 prophets, 50 each in two caves, and preserved their lives against the law and provided them with food and drink. And now her husband has died, and she's impoverished, and her creditors, her husband's creditors, are coming, take her possessions, and even to take her children, which is against the law, but there were evil people who did that in those days. She goes to Elisha and says, I'm desperate, help me. And he says to her, what do you have at home? And she says, all I have is a little container of oil. And Elisha says, go to your neighbors, your friends, and gather in all the vessels you can get. Take your children into the house with you, close the door, and pour out from that little vessel into those containers, which she does, and the little bit of oil in the original container fills all those vessels. Then she goes back to Elisha and says, what shall I do now? And he says, sell the oil, and use some of the money to pay your creditors, and use the rest of the money to live on. Fine. Say the commentators, this is blessing. That's how blessing works. Blessing takes the oil that she has and expands it. He didn't tell her, go home and you find a gold brick under your bed. You have to take something that already exists and expand it. Okay. Where does Sabbath get an expansion? What is there that already exists that gets an expansion? Now, the Talmud here has an enigmatic comment. God blessed the Sabbath day with manna. Blessed the Sabbath day with manna. What was the order of the manna? Well, it fell every day, a portion good enough for that day, except for Friday. On Friday fell a double portion, and on Shabbos fell nothing. Shabbos fell nothing, zero. So, where is Shabbos getting a blessing here? Where is Shabbos getting an increase? If the double portion fell on Friday, one half was eaten on Friday, and one half was eaten on Saturday, on Shabbos. So they didn't have any extra for Shabbos. There's a normal ration, a normal day's ration for Shabbos. So where is the blessing for Shabbos? This question is asked by the Zohar. And the Zohar explains that when it says that God blessed the Sabbath, it means he made the Sabbath into a blessing. Not that the Sabbath receives a blessing. The Shabbos is a vehicle to give, to communicate blessing. And here's how it works. Since the Shabbos is a time when the manna fell on Friday, so you go into Shabbos with the manna already in your possession, Shabbos is a time when you are judged in how you use the manna. How do you eat? Does your eating express your spirituality? Or does it, God forbid, express only your animality? If on Shabbos, when you are closest to God during the week anyhow, your eating expresses that connection to God, then through that you merit getting manna the rest of the week, the coming week. The way you eat the prior manna on Shabbos is the key to the blessing of the coming week that you will get manna to be able to eat. So, Shabbos becomes a blessing in that it generates the manna for the rest of the week, not that it receives a blessing on its own. That is one way of explaining the idea that it gets that God says God blessed it. God blessed it means that you it becomes the source of blessing for the rest. I just want to say one more word, and then I have to quit. The very beginning was, remember the Sabbath day to sanctify it. Now, sanctifying something is usually an activity. You have to do something to it to sanctify. Things don't get sanctified all by themselves. Even things that you can sanctify by words, you can point to an animal and say, you are a sacrifice. But you have to do that. It doesn't happen by itself. Here, the Torah is putting an almost paradoxical idea. Remember the Sabbath day to sanctify. It doesn't mean remember to do X and sanctify it. It means the remembering is how you sanctify it. That's all you do. Other holidays aren't like that. Other holidays have their own specific mitzvos. And those mitzvos also help in expressing the sanctity of the day. The court declares the new moon. The holidays are based on the date of the month. It's the court that determines which date of the year, of the history, will be the date in which the holiday takes place. We have a hand in creating the sanctity of the holidays. Not so with Shabbos. All we do is remember it by reciting Kiddush Friday night. We say those words, express those ideas. That's all we do. So the sense in which we're sanctifying it is more that we're recognizing its unique character and we're preparing ourselves to receive that unique character. As we said 20 minutes ago about Simcha, that the Simcha is on high. And we, if we're in tune, receive that Simcha on high. We don't create the Simcha, we receive it. That's characteristic of Shabbos in general. All of what Shabbos is something that we have to just prepare ourselves to receive. We don't create it. That's the idea of remembering the Sabbath day to sanctify it. By remembering, that's our role in sanctifying it, which is only a role of active receptivity rather than active creativity. Don't confuse being receptive with being passive. If you're playing the outfield, and your job is to catch the ball, so you're going to receive the ball into your mitt, but you're going to be very active in catching the ball. You're not going to stand there and have it come to you. You have to run and jump to catch the ball. Receptivity can be very active. Receptivity is not passive, it's active, but it's actively receiving, not actively creating. I liken it to the difference between the performer at a concert and the audience. The performer is creating the music, but the audience has to pay attention. If he's not paying attention, he will not receive the music. He's actively receptive. That's what the sanctifying of the Shabbos means. Okay?